What if the outcome of the Second World War was decided not only on the battlefield, but years earlier, inside factories that never slept? What if victory depended less on individual heroism and more on the ability to turn raw steel into endless streams of ammunition? And more importantly, could an industrial system become as decisive as any army or general? Leave a comment as you watch, because this story challenges how wars are truly won. If you want to understand how modern wars are fought and decided, subscribe to the channel, leave a like and share your thoughts below. Your comment helps keep these real historical narratives alive. When the world descended into global conflict in the early 1940s, the United States faced a reality that few civilians fully understood. Wars were no longer short, decisive clashes. They had become wars of exhaustion, where the side that could produce more weapons faster and longer would ultimately prevail. Ammunition was no longer just a military supply. It was the bloodstream of total war. Before America officially entered the conflict, Europe was already burning. Nazi Germany had demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of its war machine, combining rapid mechanized warfare with disciplined industrial output. But behind the image of unstoppable armies lay a fragile truth. German industry was centralized, vulnerable, and increasingly strained by shortages of labor, fuel, and raw materials. The United States observed this carefully. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, hesitation vanished. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that defeating Germany would require more than soldiers and tanks. It would require an industrial mobilization unlike anything the world had ever seen. The objective was not simply to match German production, but to overwhelm it so completely that the enemy could never recover. Across the American mainland, factories that once produced automobiles, refrigerators, and household tools were transformed almost overnight. Assembly lines were redesigned, machinery recalibrated, and entire workforces retrained. The sound of consumer production gave way to the constant thunder of presses, stamping brass casings, and the steady rhythm of cartridges being assembled at astonishing speed. Entire regions were reshaped by this transformation. New industrial complexes rose far from enemy bombers, deep within American territory. Railroads expanded to connect these factories to ports on both coasts. Cities grew around ammunition plants, populated by workers who understood that their labor, though far from the front lines, would determine the fate of millions. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend. Ammunition plants operated around the clock, 7 days a week. Shifts rotated endlessly, with workers sleeping during daylight hours and returning to their stations at night. Women, many of whom had never worked in heavy industry before, became the backbone of production. They handled explosives, operated precision machinery, and maintained strict quality standards, knowing that a single defect could cost a soldier's life thousands of miles away. While German factories struggled under constant Allied bombing, American plants expanded without interruption. There were no air raid sirens, no shattered roofs, no collapsed supply chains. Raw materials flowed steadily from mines and refineries, protected by geography and logistics. This security allowed planners to think not in weeks or months, but in years of sustained output. By 1942, the ammunition machine was fully unleashed. Billions of cartridges began their journey across oceans, packed into crates, loaded onto ships, and delivered to every front of the war. From the deserts of North Africa to the frozen forests of Europe, American ammunition ensured that Allied forces could keep firing long after the enemy began to ration every bullet. Yet this massive effort came at a cost that was not immediately visible. Entire communities became dependent on wartime production. Local economies revolved around factories whose sole purpose was destruction. And few stopped to ask what would happen when the war eventually ended, and the demand for endless ammunition suddenly disappeared. As the United States continued to expand this industrial engine, it was becoming clear that the war might be decided long before the final battles were fought. The question was no longer whether America could outproduce Germany, but what the consequences of such overwhelming industrial power would be once the guns finally fell silent. And this is where the story truly begins to reveal its deeper consequences. As ammunition production surged, planners in Washington began to understand something unsettling. This was no longer just an industrial effort to win a war. It was an experiment in scale, coordination, and endurance that had never been attempted before. The United States was not simply manufacturing bullets. It was building a system designed to sustain violence at a level the world had never witnessed. Federal agencies coordinated every detail. Production quotas were calculated months in advance. Rail schedules were synchronized with factory output. Ports were expanded to handle unprecedented volumes of cargo. Ammunition was treated not as a product, but as a continuous flow that could never be allowed to stop. Even a brief interruption could mean disaster on the battlefield. The logic was brutal and mathematical. Every offensive required a certain number of rounds per soldier per day. Every delay increased casualties. Every shortage shifted momentum to the enemy. War planners calculated consumption rates with cold precision, transforming human conflict into spreadsheets of steel and gunpowder. Meanwhile, Germany faced a growing nightmare. Allied bombing campaigns targeted industrial centers, transportation hubs and fuel depots. Factories were forced underground or dispersed into smaller workshops, fragmenting production. Skilled workers were drafted into the army or killed in air raids. Shortages multiplied, and quality control deteriorated under pressure. In contrast, American ammunition plants refined their processes with scientific rigor. Statistical quality control was introduced to ensure reliability. A single faulty cartridge could jam a weapon, and a jam could mean death. Every round was inspected, tested, and documented. Efficiency was not optional. It was survival. The psychological impact of this abundance reached the front lines. Soldiers knew that ammunition would arrive no matter the conditions. Artillery units fired barrages that seemed endless. Infantry advanced with confidence that resupply was guaranteed. This assurance changed behavior, tactics, and morale in subtle but decisive ways. But abundance also altered the nature of warfare itself. Firepower replaced maneuver. Suppression replaced precision. Battles became contests of endurance rather than swift engagements. The ability to sustain constant fire wore down enemy forces mentally as much as physically. Was this efficiency, or was it the industrialization of exhaustion? By the time Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Normandy, ammunition stockpiles had reached staggering levels. Beaches, fields, and temporary depots were stacked with crates, stretching as far as the eye could see. Each crate represented thousands of hours of labor by workers who would never see the battlefield, yet whose contribution was just as decisive. Behind this success, however, cracks were forming. Accidents occurred in factories handling volatile materials. Workers suffered long hours, chemical exposure, and relentless pressure to meet quotas. The patriotic language of sacrifice masked the physical and emotional toll on those who kept the machines running. Communities that had grown around ammunition plants became singularly focused. Housing, schools, and services existed to support production schedules. Children grew up listening to the hum of machinery day and night. Life was structured around shifts, sirens, and deadlines tied directly to the progress of the war. As victory began to feel inevitable, a dangerous assumption took hold. Many believed that once the war ended, these factories could simply be repurposed, the workers reassigned, and the machine gently slowed down. But history rarely unfolds so neatly. Industrial systems built for total war do not disappear quietly. The ammunition engine continued to expand even as the Axis powers weakened. Contracts were extended. New facilities were approved. Production targets remained high, driven by the fear that slowing down too early could cost lives. Few questioned whether the momentum itself had become impossible to stop, and somewhere in this relentless growth lay the seeds of what would come next, when the war no longer justified the scale of destruction that industry had learned to produce. As the war approached its final phase, the American ammunition machine reached a level of output that even its architects had not fully anticipated. Production was no longer driven solely by immediate battlefield needs, but by momentum. Factories that had been designed to operate at maximum capacity were doing exactly that, day after day, regardless of how close the conflict was to ending. By 1944 and 1945, warehouses were overflowing. Rail yards were congested with loaded cars waiting for destinations that no longer urgently required them. Ammunition continued to cross oceans in massive quantities, even as German resistance weakened and Allied forces advanced deeper into occupied territory. This surplus created a paradox. On one hand, it guaranteed absolute military dominance. On the other, it revealed how difficult it was to slow a system built for excess. Contracts locked the government into continued purchasing. Entire regional economies depended on uninterrupted production. Shutting down a plant was no longer a technical decision, but a political and social risk. Workers sensed the uncertainty. Rumors spread through factory floors. Would the plant close after victory? Would there be jobs left when the uniforms disappeared from the streets? For many, the war had provided stable income for the first time in their lives. The end of conflict now carried the threat of economic collapse. At the front, the consequences of overwhelming firepower were visible everywhere. Artillery reshaped landscapes beyond recognition. Cities were reduced to rubble, not only by bombs, but by sustained shelling made possible by endless resupply. Victory came with devastation, measured not just in casualties, but in destroyed environments and displaced populations. The moral distance between factory and battlefield grew wider. Ammunition workers rarely saw the effects of their labor. They measured success in numbers produced, shifts completed, quotas exceeded. Meanwhile, soldiers and civilians on the receiving end experienced the full weight of industrialized violence. This separation made the system efficient, but also dangerously impersonal. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, the question of what to do with this massive industrial apparatus became unavoidable. The enemy was defeated, yet the factories remained. Skilled labor, specialized machinery, and entire cities existed for a single purpose that had suddenly lost its justification. Demobilization plans were rushed and incomplete. Some facilities attempted conversion to civilian manufacturing, but many were too specialized to adapt easily. Equipment designed to assemble cartridges had little use in a consumer economy hungry for homes, appliances, and automobiles. Transition proved slower and more painful than promised. Government officials faced mounting pressure. Communities demanded answers. Workers demanded security. The same centralized planning that had enabled wartime success struggled to deliver peacetime stability. The ammunition engine, once a symbol of unity and purpose, now exposed the fragility of economies built around destruction. Abandoned production lines began to appear. Machines sat idle, coated in dust. Entire complexes were mothballed, guarded but unused. What had been the heartbeat of national power fell silent with unsettling speed. The sound that remained was not celebration, but uncertainty. Yet the story did not end with silence. These ruins carried memory, warning, and legacy. They stood as physical reminders of what happens when a society organizes itself entirely around war, and how difficult it is to return once that path has been fully embraced. And as the post-war world struggled to redefine itself, the remnants of this ammunition empire waited quietly to reveal what their existence truly meant. In the years immediately following the war, the scale of what had been built became impossible to ignore. Vast ammunition plants stretched across thousands of acres, surrounded by empty housing blocks, silent rail spurs, and warehouses filled with unused material. What had once been guarded with urgency was now watched over by a handful of caretakers and security fences. Some facilities were dismantled piece by piece. Machinery was sold as scrap, melted down or shipped to other countries as part of reconstruction efforts. Others were sealed and left intact, frozen in time, as if someone expected the war to return at any moment. Nature began its slow reclaiming. Weeds grew through concrete. Roofs collapsed. Rain and rust replaced the rhythm of production. Communities built around these factories faced harsh realities. Businesses closed. Populations declined. Workers who had mastered specialized skills discovered that their expertise had little value in a civilian economy. The promise that wartime sacrifice would be rewarded with post-war prosperity proved uneven at best. Yet, strategically, the lessons were absorbed. Military planners around the world studied what the United States had accomplished. The conclusion was unmistakable. Industrial capacity, not just battlefield tactics, defined modern power. The ability to produce at scale became a permanent component of national security doctrine. This realization fueled a new era. Although the ammunition plants of the Second World War faded, their logic survived. The Cold War transformed industrial mobilization into a constant state of readiness. Factories no longer shut down completely. Instead, they adapted to cycles of tension, proxy wars, and deterrence. The silence of 1945 would never fully return. The physical ruins became symbols with conflicting meanings. For some, they represented victory and sacrifice. For others, they stood as warnings about the costs of total war. Walking through these abandoned spaces, it was impossible to ignore how human effort, ingenuity, and suffering had been concentrated toward a single destructive purpose. Historians later argued that the war had been decided long before the final battles. Once the American ammunition engine reached full capacity, the outcome became statistically inevitable. Germany could not match the volume, consistency, or security of production. Bombing accelerated defeat, but it was industrial imbalance that sealed it. This raises uncomfortable questions. If wars are won by factories rather than soldiers, where does responsibility truly lie? Is victory achieved on the battlefield or in boardrooms and production schedules? And when industry becomes inseparable from warfare, can a nation ever truly return to peace? The ruins offer no answers, only echoes. They remind us that efficiency and morality do not always align, and that the systems built in moments of fear can outlast the fear itself. Steel frameworks and empty assembly halls testify to decisions made under pressure, decisions whose consequences extend far beyond their original intent. As decades passed, some sites were repurposed. A few became museums. Others were converted into industrial parks or simply erased from the landscape, but many remained untouched. Too costly to demolish, too uncomfortable to fully confront. These forgotten places stand as monuments not just to victory, but to transformation. They show how a nation reshaped itself to win a war, and how difficult it was to reshape itself again afterward. And yet, the final chapter of this story is not found in decay, but in understanding what this machinery changed forever. What remains today is not just concrete, rust, and abandoned rail lines. What remains is a shift in how wars are understood and fought. The American ammunition engine of the Second World War did more than supply soldiers. It redefined the relationship between industry, government, and conflict in a way that has never been reversed. From that moment forward, military strength was inseparable from economic capacity. Nations measured power not only in divisions and weapons, but in factories, supply chains, and the ability to sustain prolonged production under pressure. The battlefield extended backward, deep into civilian life, into budgets, labor markets, and technological research. The ruins scattered across the American landscape quietly testify to this transformation. They show how quickly a society can mobilize when survival feels at stake, and how difficult it is to demobilize once systems of scale are in place. What was built to defeat one enemy became a blueprint for future conflicts, shaping strategy long after the original purpose vanished. For the people who lived and worked in these industrial cities, the legacy was personal. Some remembered pride and purpose. Others remembered exhaustion, danger, and sudden unemployment. Their experiences remind us that industrial victory carries human consequences that do not disappear when treaties are signed. This story forces a final reflection. The war was not won by a single battle, a single general, or a single moment of triumph. It was won through accumulation, through repetition, through the relentless conversion of resources into firepower until resistance became mathematically impossible. But if wars are decided by production curves and logistics charts, what does that mean for the future of conflict? Have we learned restraint or simply perfected the mechanics of destruction? And when industrial capacity becomes the ultimate weapon, who truly bears responsibility for how it is used? These questions linger in the silence of abandoned factories and forgotten rail yards. They challenge the comforting narratives of heroism and invite a deeper understanding of how power operates in the modern world. The ammunition engine that once roared across the American interior is gone. In its place stands memory. Memory of what it took to win, of what was sacrificed, and of what was permanently changed. Understanding this history is not about glorifying war. It is about recognizing the forces that shape it and acknowledging that the last shot fired is rarely the moment when a war truly ends. If this story made you rethink how wars are won, share your thoughts in the comments. History lives on through questions, and through those willing to confront the realities behind victory.